All right. Good morning, everybody. How are you all doing? Hope you're doing well. Excited to be with you guys on this Friday. It's going to be a nice weather day, it looks like out there. And so it should be an amazing day. Hey, before we get started, any questions, anything specific you want to talk about before I jump into what I'm planning to talk about? All right. I'll either take that as a no or that nobody can hear me, but I'm sure Jason would have let me know if nobody could hear me. So I know that's not the problem. So anyway, okay, cool. Well, hey, what I thought I would talk about today, let me get my screen share going here is Jason and I were talking yesterday and thought it would be good to talk a little bit and go through the buyer's notice and seller's notice of cancellation. And so just a reminder, and there's actually a couple of things that as we go through this, we're going to start with it being pretty basic, but as we go through it, there's a few things that potentially you may not have been aware of and or may have questions on. So anyway, as you are going to be canceling, if you're on the buyer side of the transaction, I want to go through this form and we're going to talk about the different options that are available. And like I said, we'll talk about a few things that you may or may not have been aware of, or maybe just needed a reminder about. So, first few again are pretty basic. So the first one here is just this notice of cancellation prior to the due diligence deadline. So as a reminder, if you are canceling prior to that due diligence deadline, the buyer can cancel for any reason. It's just in their sole discretion. They can just say, I don't feel like the property works, and they're going to check this box and sign the document, and then you're going to send it over to the other agent for and notify them, hey, the buyer's canceling based on section 8.1. And again, as a reminder, a lot of times I just like to say, just tell them, don't get into the specifics of why. I feel like you're best just to say, hey, we're canceling based on 8.1. And if they ask what specifically, just keep in mind that really you would need your client's permission to disclose what the reasoning behind their cancellation is. So anyway, so that's the first one. Second one here is the notice of cancellation that's after the due diligence deadline, but prior to the financing and appraisal deadline. So if the buyer is wanting to cancel and they're going to cancel after due diligence, but before finance and appraisal, then it gives them two different options down here. So if they're canceling based on section 8.2, the earnest money will be released to the buyer, and keep in mind the notice of appraised value is attached. So I'm going to go down to section 8.2 here that talks about that in the REPSI. And as a reminder, it says in here that after the completion of the appraisal by a licensed appraiser, if the buyer receives written notice from the lender or the appraiser that the property is appraised for less than the purchase price, and then that's what's going to be called the notice of appraised value, then the buyer can cancel by providing the written notice, which would be our form right here, would serve as that written notice, checking the box, but then also provide to them the written notice that they received, the notice of appraised value. And so again, on this one, my recommendation is that when you're canceling based on the appraisal, is send over the notice of appraised value. I would say don't send over the actual appraisal to the for that. Now you can, but again, just I've shared the story before of we had a scenario where the agent did share that appraisal, and then the listing agent went through the appraisal and came back arguing that it did appraise for the value. And anyway, it created all these problems. But if we would have just had something in writing from the lender saying, hey, it failed to appraise, then that is sufficient, and that would be my recommendation for what you send over to them. So anyway, hopefully if you have any questions, you guys feel free to stop and we can talk about it. If canceling under Section 8.3BI of the REPC, then the earnest money will be released according to that section. So now this one, keep in mind that 8.3BI is the buyer's right to cancel before the financing and appraisal deadline. So if they're canceling before that financing and appraisal deadline, then this section is what would be the section that's going to take governance of how the earnest money is released. So in this section, it's detailing out that if the buyer's canceling in their sole discretion, if they're not satisfied with the terms and conditions of the loan, but it's after the due diligence deadline, then they can cancel by providing written notice to the seller, which again would be that notice of cancellation. And it's prior to the financing and appraisal deadline, whereupon whatever dollar amount you put in there of the buyer's earnest money will be released to the seller without the requirement of further written authorization from the buyer. So again, if they're checking this box here, they're canceling the based on the finance section, but it's after due diligence and before finance and appraisal deadline, then the earnest money is going to be released. However much in here will go to the seller, and then the remaining will be released to the buyer. So hopefully that all makes sense. And again, if not, feel free to unmute and we can talk about it. Okay, so the next one. The next section on this form, the buyer's notice of cancellation, is the notice of cancellation based on the financing condition. So 8.3BII after financing and appraisal deadline. So remember, what we just talked about was if you're canceling before the financing and appraisal deadline, this one would be, okay, if you're canceling after. So now if we go back into the REPC and go to section 8.3B, and then you've got II and III, so 2 and 3 here. The buyer can cancel after the financing and appraisal deadline. And so this section, it's important that you make sure you understand this, because when somebody ends up canceling on this, based on this, it's important for you to make sure that your client, if you're on the listing side, understands what that means for them. So if after the expiration of the financing and appraisal deadline in 24C, the buyer fails to get the loan, meaning they don't have the proceeds delivered, then the buyer will not be obligated to purchase the property, and the buyer or seller may cancel the REPC by providing written notice to the other party. But we're specifically talking right now, though, of the buyer being the one, because this is the buyer's notice of cancellation. So if the buyer cancels it after that financing and appraisal deadline, then we go down here to number 3, which says that if the REPC is canceled as provided in this section above, then the buyer agrees that all of their earnest money will be released to the seller without the requirement of further written authorization from the buyer. And then here's the key piece to make sure your seller understands when they're agreeing to this as they accept the contract. The seller is agreeing to accept as seller's exclusive remedy. So this is their only remedy if the buyer cancels based on finance after the financing and appraisal deadline. The earnest money deposit or deposits as liquidated damages. So they're going to accept it as liquidated damages, and then they agree that the liquidated damages would be difficult and impractical to calculate, and that the earnest money deposit or deposits is a fair and reasonable estimate of the seller's damage in the event the buyer fails to obtain the loan. So here's the important thing, I guess, to remember this. And granted, you're negotiating when you're doing this offer, when you're presenting the offer and the seller is now countering. But when you're representing the seller, you need to stop and think about, is this earnest money, if the buyer were to take us all the way to right before settlement and then cancel based on the finance and appraisal deadline, if they cancel based on that, the only remedy that the seller gets is that earnest money. And I've seen a number of times where that happens, it gets canceled, and then the seller is like, yeah, but now I'm out all this additional extra money because of these other plans and things that I had. What can we do about it? Well, the answer is you can't do anything about it. And so when you're representing the seller on this, keep in mind, like, is that earnest money going to offset decisions and things that they've done? Now, I know that's difficult to gauge maybe as you're first negotiating the contract, but keep that in mind, that is the seller's sole remedy if the buyer cancels based on finance and appraisal after the or excuse me, if they cancel based on finance after the finance and appraisal deadline. So so again, part of why Jason and I felt like it would be good to go through this is just make sure when you are canceling, you're checking the right boxes, because we have seen where somebody comes in to do the notice of cancellation and they're checking the wrong box, because again, there's two different boxes here for the finance condition. This one is for if you're canceling before, this one's if you're canceling after. And so it's important to make sure you're checking the right box on that cancellation. Okay. I must be doing a really good job because there's no questions so far. So, or I made it to where nobody could unmute. So anyway,
Russ,
that's fine.
I have a
Yes.
question.
Yes.
Um, so this actually happened to me, but it was my daughter's house. She wasn't
Okay.
very happy. They actually canceled after all of the deadlines, right? But it was a VA loan. And typically, VA is no money down. And so the earnest money was not very much. Um, and so, can we do an addendum that says if you do it, like, you owe, I don't know how they'll owe it because you can't really keep it. Anyway, is there something else we can do? Because, like, if somebody wants to buy a VA and they don't have a lot of money down, yeah, what do you do?
Yeah. Yep. That's a great question. So that would be just something that you're needing to discuss with the client. And then what I would say though is what you could do if they don't have a lot for the down end or whatever they're doing the VA loan, you really still could do maybe you accept, and this may be the option for really any time you're representing the seller, but is just keeping in mind this additional earnest money section, is that what you would say is, after due diligence and finance and appraisal, the buyer is going to increase the earnest money by X amount of dollars. Now on the VA, like you're saying, um, they don't have to put any money down. So you still could though, and Tracy, talking about your exact scenario of that for your daughter who is the seller, is now they're left with nothing really on that. But they could have said, hey, we want X amount of dollars for earnest money once we get past that, because then if they did cancel based on the finance section, they would be entitled to whatever that earnest money is, because again, it talks here earnest money deposit or deposits because of the additional earnest money. So that would be the only real way you could go about doing it. And again, like I say, I get the balance of this, of we're trying to negotiate an offer and we don't want to chase away a buyer right off the bat by asking for a ton of earnest money. But at the same time, keep in mind that I guess I would just say is we want to make sure we're educating our seller, future pacing them of letting them know, hey, here's a scenario. This is a VA loan, and as a result of that, they're probably going to have a low amount of earnest money. The risk we're going to run is if they do cancel for some reason, this is what we end up being left with is, 500 or $1,000. And just know that's the risk going in, so that down the road, if something happens, we can let them know, yeah, that's what we were talking about. So I don't know if that helps, Tracy, but
One thing on that, Russ, just because they're VA and they don't have to do a down payment doesn't mean the earnest money needs to be a low amount. I mean, as a seller, you can always go back and counter them at a higher earnest money, even though they're not going to put a whole lot of money down. I think they're two separate things. I think sometimes we look at VA as they don't have any money, but it's just actually a really good program for veterans, and they could have plenty of money to do it.
yeah, good point. Thanks, Jason. And they get that back at closing. They would just get the earnest money back. It would get refunded to them because they're doing zero down. So Cool. Okay. Next section
Thank
is the
you.
risk. Yep, you're welcome. Next one is the risk of loss. So this section, and again, keep in mind, we're talking about the buyer canceling based on risk of loss. So in that section of the REPC, what it says is if prior to closing, any part of the property is damaged or destroyed by fire, vandalism, flood, earthquake, an act of God, that such the risk of such a loss or damage shall be borne by the seller. So if any of those things happen, the seller's responsible. But then it goes on to say, however, if the cost of repairing that is going to be 10% or greater, or excuse me, if it's going to exceed 10%. So if it's 10%, the seller would still need to pay for it. But if it's going to exceed 10% of the purchase price, then at that point, either the buyer or the seller could cancel the REPC by providing written notice, and all the earnest money is returned to the buyer. So that's it. Again, if the buyer is canceling. Next option you have on here is subject to the sale of the buyer's property addendum. So on that addendum, if the buyer is saying, hey, here's my offer, but it's subject to us selling our home, then here's what the options are: is the buyer's right to cancel before the due diligence deadline or the financing and appraisal, and then you've got one for canceling after due diligence or financing and appraisal, whichever is later. So both of these, keep in mind, this subject to the sale is if they're canceling before either due diligence or financing and appraisal, and it's whichever is later, which almost always that ends up being the financing and appraisal deadline. So keep in mind on this addendum that this cancellation is up to the date of whichever is later, finance and appraisal or due diligence. But again, almost always it's going to be your finance and appraisal. So if they're canceling before that, then the buyer can cancel for any reason. Again, it's in their sole discretion. If they haven't closed on the sale of their property, then the earnest money will be released to the buyer without any further authorization from the seller. And if it's after the deadline, then that earnest money will be released to the seller without any authorization from the buyer. So again, back to here, we're sending over this cancellation saying, hey, we're canceling based on the subject to the sale of the buyer's property addendum. And then based on that, we're going to say, okay, was it before or after the finance and appraisal deadline or due diligence if that happened to be later, whichever is later, then either the buyer gets it if it's before or the seller gets it if it's after. So you're checking the box here, and then we would look to this to say, okay, which deadline is it? Is it before or after? Okay. And then the next one is the FHA VA loan addendum. Now, this one is one that we have somewhat going on right now. I'm not sure if it's been satisfied or not yet with the agent, but if you're canceling based on the FHA or VA loan addendum. Now, the reason you would be canceling based on that FHA or VA loan addendum is going to be that the buyer is either getting an FHA loan or a VA loan and it failed to appraise. So this section here is just saying it doesn't matter the finance and appraisal deadline. The buyer shall not be obligated to complete the purchase or incur any penalty or forfeiture of any earnest money or other down payment, or be obligated to purchase the property if it's a VA loan, if it is the purchase price exceeds the reasonable value of the property established by the VA appraisal that was done, or on an FHA, if it is higher. So if it fails to appraise either for a FHA or a VA, the buyer is entitled to their earnest money. Now, the reason I say we have this one going on right now is if you remember back to COVID, there was a lot of this going on, but we have one right now in the company where they made the earnest money to be non-refundable for any reason. So the question then for you guys would be, if there's an addendum that says that the earnest money is non-refundable for any reason, and they're getting either an FHA or a VA loan and it fails to appraise, who gets the earnest money back and why? Do, 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 do.
I'm going to say the buyer
Do. Oh, there we go. Okay, why?
because of this information right here. It protects because it's a government loan, maybe about
Okay,
that.
cool. Any other thoughts, or anybody think the other way? You guys are like, well, you wouldn't be asking if it was just the seller saying for any reason. Yeah. So if we go to the bottom of this FHA addendum, here's what it says. If any provision of this Rep C or this addendum, so again, this is basically saying if any provision of the whole real estate purchase contract or on this specific addendum is inconsistent with any currently applicable law governing FHA or VA loan transactions, then to the extent of such inconsistencies, the law shall govern. So basically, what this is saying is you can't give up that right. So even if you put it in the contract. Now, I am not recommending, oh, well, then just anytime it's an FHA or VA loan, throw in their non-refundable earnest money. Like, don't try to be deceptive, but just kind of keep in mind that you cannot override this law when it comes to an FHA or a VA loan, that the federal law is going to govern. So when I had the agent call me and say, hey, we got a problem, and I think it was an FHA, and he said it now didn't appraise, what's going to happen, and I'm saying the buyer would be entitled to that earnest money back, even though it said non-refundable. All right. The next one is the secondary backup contract addendum. And then it says, see section 1.3. So if we go to secondary backup, section 1.3 says the buyer's right to cancel at any time prior to the backup contract becoming the primary contract. Then the buyer can cancel by providing written notice to the seller. And then the earnest money would be going right back to the buyer. Okay. And then the final one that we'll talk about on here is the short sale addendum section 7. And on the short sale addendum section 7, now keep in mind on this one is either the buyer or the seller can cancel the REPSI by providing written notice to the other party. And in that instance, the earnest money deposit shall be returned, if any, shall be returned to the buyer without the requirement of further authorization from the seller. And the buyer and seller acknowledge and agree that this mutual right of cancellation is fair and reasonable to both parties. So anytime prior to you getting this offer, you're getting the third party approval and it becoming a approved short sale, either the buyer or the seller could cancel. So, okay. And then, oh, I guess one other thing on here is there is a spot for other that you could check and detail out some other reason. But I would say if you're doing that, work with Jason or I on it as you do an other, just so we make sure. And then this will go a lot quicker, but we've got the seller's notice of cancellation. So when the seller's canceling, the options they have is the short sale addendum section 7, which we just barely went through right here. Okay. And they have the financing conditions, Rep C 8.3B, which again, we talked about that earlier, but that's if they're canceling after the finance and appraisal deadline. So the seller could come in and say, okay, it's after financing and appraisal and they failed to get the loan, therefore we're canceling it. So they're going to check the box here, which would then push us down to here saying, okay, the seller's entitled to that earnest money. The seller financing addendum, and this one actually, I need to get word to the MLS because I think this is a typo. It says seller financing addendum section 8, but if you go to section 8 is all about title insurance. But section 7.1 gives the seller the right to cancel. So on that one, if it's a seller financing, then the seller, in their sole discretion, if they determine that the results of the seller's review of those documents are unacceptable, then no later than the due diligence deadline, they could cancel the REPSI, which is what this one would be for the seller canceling based on the seller finance addendum. And then the final one is them canceling based on risk of loss, which we already went through that section. Again, if there's damage that exceeds 10% of the purchase price, then the seller could cancel. And again, either the buyer or seller, but in this case, it would be the seller saying, hey, we're canceling because the damage done to the property exceeds 10%. So really that one is the only way. Like sometimes an agent will call me and say, is there any way my seller could get out of this? And I say, yes, section 20.2. So if the seller wants to get out, they just got to go have over 10% damage done to the property, which probably is not going to be worth doing. So really the seller doesn't have a whole lot of outs beyond the short sale addendum. If it's after they don't get the loan after the financing and appraisal deadline, or the seller financing. So anyway,
Hey, Russ,
yes, go ahead.
that, how is it determined if it's over 10%? So it's like the seller could say, oh, it's over 10%, but really legally, how do they determine? Is it by an insurance person or whatever?
Yeah, you'd probably have to get bids and or insurance, stuff like that. Just something showing that, hey, here's the damage, and then here's what it's going to cost to repair that damage.
Thank you.
So, yep. But more than likely, if it exceeds 10%, my guess is the buyer's probably like, yeah, if you're not willing to pay to fix it, I'm not dealing with it. But it is important to keep in mind that if that damage does happen and it's less than 10%, by the contract, the seller's already agreed they will make any of those repairs. All right, any other questions?
What if they don't have enough extra money to make the repairs?
Well, then they shouldn't agree to it. I mean, I don't know what to say, but because on the contract, by signing the contract, they are agreeing if that happens. Now, luckily, I don't know that I have ever seen it happen in my career where there's been that type of damage that was caused the deal to fall apart. So,
Well,
So
yeah, I
the
mean,
buyer maybe could sue for the earnest money, the seller, couldn't they? If the seller failed to repair?
yeah, if they failed to, they would be in default of the contract. So go ahead, Jason, what you were going to say.
it said most likely if you're a 10% loss in your home, most homes have owner's insurance.
Yeah.
And if they have a loan on it, it has homeowner's insurance, the seller would have to just do a claim and get it fixed. So the seller should be able to fix it, but that would be a rare thing.
Yeah, I think it would be pretty rare because, like you're saying, is if there's a loan on the property, their lender is going to make sure they have homeowners insurance, and if they don't, if it's paid for, so if they don't have a loan against the property, then I guess it's possible they could not have it. But if that's the case, then they have enough equity, they could go borrow against it to do the repairs to get the property sold. All right. Well, hey, thank you for being on with us. We really appreciate you taking the time to get on, and appreciate all the questions and things. And have an awesome weekend, and we'll talk to you next time.
Thanks, Russ.
Thank
Thank
you.
You
you.
bet. See ya.